The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Sunshine finally left the school building, her thoughts swirling with an unsettling heaviness. The day had started like any other, mundane, predictable, but there had been something off in the air all morning, a tension that settled in her chest and made her skin prickle. It wasn't until the strange events during her last class that she realized how wrong everything felt. The teacher, Miss Carmichael, had been speaking about historical events, but her voice had started to waver, as though she were reading from a page she couldn't quite remember. The chalk screeched across the board, an unsettling sound that vibrated through Sunshine's bones, sending a ripple of nausea through her. When she glanced up, she could have sworn Miss Carmichael's face momentarily morphed, her eyes widening, her skin paling as if someone else had been wearing her face for a moment. The shift was so sudden that Sunshine blinked and it was gone, replaced by a sweet, calm smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you okay, Sunshine?" A voice snapped her back to the present. It was Heather, her best friend, standing beside her in the hallway as they both headed for the exit. Her voice was laced with concern, but Sunshine could see the uncertainty in Heather's eyes too. Sunshine nodded weakly, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had been growing in the pit of her stomach all day. "Just tired," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she didn't believe them. As she walked home, the familiar route down Main Street seemed altered, darker somehow, even though the sun hadn't fully set. Sunshine shook her head, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. There was something in the air, something wrong. She paused at a corner near the old park, staring at the rusted swing set that creaked despite there being no wind. The eerie sound cut through the stillness, and as her gaze shifted toward the town's abandoned library, she noticed something odd. A small, weathered photograph laying on the pavement beneath a fallen tree branch. Curiosity got the better of her, and she approached it slowly, her heart beating faster with each step. The photograph was partially buried in the dirt, its edges curled with age. She bent down and picked it up, brushing off the dirt and grime, and that's when she saw it. A younger version of herself, barely 5 or 6 years old, her face alight with a joyful, carefree smile. But the surrounding figures in the photograph made Sunshine's breath catch in her throat. The people standing next to her were not family members as she would expect. They were strangers. And their faces were twisted, distorted, as if their expressions were pulled into unnatural grins, too wide, too malicious. Some had eyes that were too big, others had mouths stretched far too thin. All of them were looking at her, not with the warmth of family, but with an eerily knowing gaze, like they knew something about her, about the future, something she couldn't understand. Sunshine's stomach twisted. How could this be? She had no memory of this photo being taken. She had never seen those people before. Her fingers trembled as she turned the photograph over, expecting to find some clue, a name, a date, something. But the back was blank, completely clean. It was as though it had never existed at all, except that it was in her hands and it was hers. A chill swept through her, and she quickly stuffed the photograph into her jacket pocket, feeling like it weighed more than it should. She turned to leave, but the air around her seemed to hum with a low, unsettling vibration, like a heartbeat echoing too loudly in the distance. She spun around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, but the street was empty. No one was around. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. By the time Sunshine reached her home, the sky had deepened into a twilight blue. The house, usually welcoming, now felt strangely cold. She walked inside, shrugging off her jacket and dropping her bag by the door. The house was unnervingly quiet. "Mom?" she called out, but there was no response. Sunshine walked through the house, growing more uneasy with each passing second. Her mother, always so attentive, usually greeted her after school, but today there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Sunshine's gaze landed on the kitchen, where she noticed her mother sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of her. Her posture was rigid like a statue. "Mom?" Sunshine said again, stepping forward. Her mother didn't react. She stared blankly at the empty chair across from her, her hands resting stiffly on the table. For a moment, Sunshine thought her mother was simply lost in thought, but when she looked closer, she saw the unusual stillness in her eyes, the way her pupils didn't move, didn't blink. Sunshine's pulse quickened. "Mom?" she repeated, reaching out to touch her shoulder. Her mother's head snapped up, her expression instantly shifting into a soft, gentle smile. "Oh, Sunshine," she said, her voice smooth as though nothing had happened. "How was your day? You look tired." Sunshine froze, blinking rapidly. What was happening? Her mother had been so distant recently, so cold, almost like she was a different person. But now she was back to normal. Too normal. Too perfect. As if nothing had ever changed. Sunshine stepped back, a cold sweat forming on her brow. Her mother's eyes followed her, unblinking, a serene smile still pasted on her face. "Are you all right, sweetheart? You're acting strange." She wanted to scream. To ask her mother about the strange happenings, about the odd events at school, about the photograph she'd found, about why everything felt wrong. But as the words lingered on her lips, Sunshine hesitated. Her mother was right there, smiling at her, acting as if everything was fine. What if it was her own mind that was breaking? "Yeah, I'm fine," Sunshine whispered, forcing a smile she didn't feel. The photograph pressed heavily in her pocket, a constant reminder of the chilling reality she was now beginning to understand. But what was that reality? Was the curse already inside her? Had it been there all along, whispering, watching, shaping her life from the shadows? The questions churned inside her, the weight of the photograph growing heavier with every thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, she was at the center of something much darker than she could ever have imagined. But no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it, Sunshine knew one thing for sure. Her life was never going to be the same again. The days following the unsettling discovery of the photograph felt like a blur to Sunshine. Everything had gone back to a strange semblance of normalcy. Her mother was acting as if nothing had changed, as if there hadn't been an invisible shift in the atmosphere, like the world had somehow righted itself, despite the growing tension inside her. Sunshine couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something sinister was just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was just after midnight when it began. At first, it was faint, a whisper on the edge of her consciousness, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. She had woken up from another restless sleep, the kind where her mind never truly settled. Her body was exhausted, but her thoughts wouldn't let her rest. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, her mind swirling with the image of the photograph, the twisted faces that seemed to leer at her from the past. The quiet of the night should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like it was pressing in on her, suffocating her. The whisper came again, a voice that seemed to slide into her thoughts, not through her ears, but inside her mind, as if it had always been there, waiting. Sunshine. Her breath hitched, her body stiffening as the name echoed in the silence of her room. It was so soft yet unmistakable. She jerked upright, her eyes scanning the darkened room, the shadows stretching long across the walls. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling as she threw the blankets off her body, her feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. The voice was no longer a whisper but a low, almost soothing hum vibrating through her bones. "I am the old one," the voice murmured, and a shiver crawled up her spine. It wasn't a voice like any other, there was something ancient about it, a depth that seemed to stretch across centuries. "You have heard of me before, Sunshine. I have been here watching, waiting." Sunshine's heart began to race. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, taking a step toward the edge of the bed, her breath shallow, her mind reeling. "Who are you?" The voice seemed to respond to her question with an almost amused tone, as if the answer were something so obvious it didn't need to be spoken aloud. "I am the old one, and I have been here long before you." The words struck her like a physical blow, a knot forming in her stomach. "What do you mean? What are you talking about? How have I heard of you before?" Her voice shook, but there was no turning back now, she needed answers. "You have always been a part of this town, Sunshine. You have always been a part of the family." The voice softened as it spoke those final words, a subtle change in tone that chilled her to the core. "Join us, Sunshine. Join your family." The words echoed in her head, and she felt the weight of them like a dark promise. The old one's presence was all around her now, pressing in on her from every corner of the room. "The family has waited so long," the voice continued, "and now you will complete what has been started." Sunshine's heart thudded painfully in her chest, the weight of the words almost too much to bear. Her hand instinctively went to her throat, as if trying to quiet the rising panic that threatened to overtake her. "What does that mean? What do you want from me?" But the voice was gone, leaving only a haunting silence in its wake. The room was still, and Sunshine stood frozen at the edge of her bed, her body trembling uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, her mind reeling from the enormity of what had just happened. With a shaky breath, she stumbled back into her bed, pulling the covers around her like a shield. She closed her eyes tightly, hoping that when she opened them again, it would all be gone, that it was just a figment of her imagination, a nightmare brought on by the stress and fear that had been consuming her. But deep down she knew that wasn't the case. It was a few hours later, when the first light of dawn began to filter through her curtains, that the dreams started. At first, they were nothing more than fleeting images, strange and fragmented, but they quickly turned into something far more disturbing. In the dream, she was lying in a small, cramped space, the air thick and suffocating. She struggled to move, but the weight on top of her was unbearable. She was trapped, her hands clawing at the sides of a wooden box, the smell of damp earth filling her nostrils as she desperately gasped for air. The world above her was silent, save for the faint sound of the dirt shifting and falling, burying her further. Her breath quickened, panic rising in her chest as she tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Help!" she cried, her voice muffled by the wood, but there was no response. The air around her grew thick, and the edges of her vision started to blur, her limbs growing weaker with each passing moment. And then, just as the darkness seemed to close in completely, her eyes snapped open. Sunshine shot up from her bed, gasping for breath, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was bathed in early morning light, and for a brief, fleeting moment she thought the nightmare was over. But something was wrong. She looked down at her hands and dirt was caked under her nails, the unmistakable smell of earth still lingering in the air. She wasn't in her bed anymore, she was lying in the same position she had been in during her dream, and the ground beneath her felt solid, too real. She was buried. Her body jerked with terror as the memories of the dream crashed over her like waves. The coffin. The suffocating darkness. The air thick with the smell of damp earth. She clawed at the sheets, her heart racing as she tried to sit up, to get away from the nightmare that felt all too real. But then the truth hit her. Sunshine wasn't dreaming. She had been buried, in the cemetery beneath the weight of the earth. And she had somehow made her way back to her bed, covered in dirt. The panic surged in her chest once again. Had it been a vision? A warning? Or was the voice in her head, the one that claimed to be the old one, manipulating her mind? Was it trying to show her what had already been decided for her, what was inevitably going to happen? Was the town pulling her closer, wrapping its dark tendrils around her, forcing her to take her place in its horrifying cycle? She stumbled out of bed, her legs weak as she touched her forehead, feeling the dampness of sweat. She needed to get out of there. She had to understand what was happening. The whisper of the old one still echoed in her mind, as if it were waiting for her to join the family, to take the final step toward whatever fate awaited her. The line between reality and nightmare was growing thinner with every passing second. Sunshine wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. But she knew one thing for sure now, whatever was happening to her, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The night sky hung heavy, thick with the scent of rain, as the townsfolk gathered beneath the looming shadow of the blood moon. It bathed the town in a sickly crimson hue, casting an otherworldly light on the crumbling streets, making everything feel unreal, like the world itself was teetering on the edge of some unspeakable horror. Sunshine stood at the edge of the town square, her mind racing. She had to stop this. She had to break free, even if it meant confronting the very thing that had haunted her since the moment she'd first heard the whispers in her head. The old one. Pastor Jacobs had warned her, "You don't have a choice. None of us do." But she couldn't accept it. She couldn't accept that this was her fate, that she was destined to join the twisted ranks of the Sunshine Girls, the living sacrifices who kept the curse alive. The town had to be stopped. There had to be a way to end the cycle. With trembling hands, Sunshine stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the ritual drawing closer, feel the eyes of the townsfolk watching her, waiting for her to make her move. The crowd, a mass of shadowed faces under the sickly light of the blood moon, parted before her as if in reverence, but she didn't hesitate. She would confront them all. She would confront the curse itself. Just as she took another step, ready to shout, ready to expose the truth, the air around her seemed to shift. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, like the earth itself was trembling. Her vision blurred and the world began to distort. The familiar streets of the town morphed, bending at impossible angles. A sudden pulling sensation took hold of her, a force stronger than anything she had ever felt before. Her body stiffened, and before she could react, she was yanked violently from the familiar world, as though the very fabric of reality had torn open and swallowed her whole. Her head spun, her breath caught in her throat. The world around her warped, darkness consumed the edges of her vision, like she was falling into an endless void. The sensations were overwhelming, each one more suffocating than the last. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Sunshine stumbled to her knees, gasping for breath. She looked around, trying to comprehend what had happened. Her mind screamed for an explanation, but none came. She was standing in the town square once again, but it was wrong. It was reversed. The streets were still cobblestone, but they seemed cracked, like they had been hastily rebuilt. The sky above was still red with the blood moon, but it was more intense here, as if it was pressing down, suffocating everything. And the people, the townsfolk, were here too, but they were different. They weren't the hollow-eyed, broken figures she had seen in the real world. No, these were the same people, but they were alive, too alive, twisted into something unnatural. Their faces were painted with dark, vacant smiles, and their eyes gleamed with malicious intent. The life was gone from their eyes. What remained was pure, unfathomable darkness. They moved with purpose, walking with a kind of ritualistic grace, as if they were all part of a preordained performance. Her heart raced as she stood up, her mind desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as her feet echoed against the cobblestones, she felt the chilling pull of familiarity. The people here were, she couldn't believe it, alive but corrupted. They were part of this twisted reflection, part of the cycle, like echoes from the real world. Then she saw her. In the center of it all, standing on the steps of a building she didn't recognize, was her mother. But this wasn't the mother she had known, the one who had been cold and distant, the one who had seemed so broken. No, this version of her mother was different, twisted, cruel, and powerful. She stood with an air of command, her face framed by the red glow of the blood moon. The clothes she wore were ceremonial, black and flowing, adorned with symbols Sunshine didn't recognize. And then her mother spoke. "The time has come, Sunshine. You have always been part of this." Sunshine froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes flicked to the people surrounding her mother. They were all staring at her now, their smiles widening with anticipation. Her stomach twisted, nausea rising as the words settled in. Her mother was the one leading the rituals. The realization was too much to bear. Her mother had known all along. She had always been part of this twisted cycle, playing a role she had accepted without question. And now Sunshine was to play her part. The blood moon above seemed to pulse, its light growing brighter with each passing second, and the townsfolk began to chant in low voices, their words unintelligible but somehow familiar. Sunshine could feel their eyes upon her, could feel the weight of their gaze. It wasn't just the townsfolk she had to worry about, it was the curse itself, watching, waiting for her next move. Before she could comprehend what was happening, her mother's voice rang out again, cold and commanding. "It's too late, Sunshine. You can't escape it. The curse lives on through you. You are the next incarnation, the next Sunshine Girl." Her world tilted. A wave of dizziness crashed over her, and for the briefest moment, the town and its twisted inhabitants began to fade. Her mind flashed to the ritual, to the endless cycle of death and rebirth that had been woven into the fabric of this place. She could no longer deny it. She had been chosen from the beginning, just like Isabella, just like the others before her. The cycle couldn't be broken. No matter how many sacrifices were made, curse would always find a new vessel. Each Sunshine Girl was just another piece in the puzzle, a puzzle that could never be completed. The mirror version of the town began to fade, dissolving into darkness, but not before Sunshine caught a glimpse of her reflection. She was no longer just herself. She was an embodiment of the town's curse, its inevitable next Sunshine Girl. She was trapped. When the world around her snapped back into focus, Sunshine was standing alone in the square once more, the townsfolk gone. But she knew the truth now, the curse was not something that could be escaped. It was part of her. She was part of it. The blood moon had finally descended beneath the horizon, casting an eerie shadow over the entire town. Sunshine could feel the pulse of the curse now, like an unholy heartbeat syncing with her own. There was no escaping it. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how many times she ran, it always found her, pulling her deeper into its twisted grip. She found herself standing at the center of the ritual circle in the town square, unable to move, frozen. It felt as if her body had been paralyzed by an unseen force, every nerve in her body screaming for release, but she could only stand there, motionless, as the moonlight flickered with unnatural intensity. She was caught, suspended in time. And as the world around her began to blur and twist, she could feel the very fabric of the curse wrapping tighter and tighter around her. Suddenly, everything changed. Her vision shifted violently, and she was no longer in the square. She was thrust into a nightmarish flood of memories, Every single death in the town's history. She was drowning in them. The screams, the pleading, the terror, they were all around her, suffocating her. Faces she didn't recognize but who felt familiar. People she had never seen before, their eyes wide with panic, their faces twisted in unimaginable pain as they were consumed by whatever evil had haunted this town for centuries. The chilling whispers of those who had fallen, those who had been sacrificed, echoed in her ears, the voices blending into a chorus of despair. Sunshine couldn't look away. She was trapped in this vision, unable to close her eyes to block it out. The pain, the agony, of the deaths she had never witnessed but now felt as though they were her own, pierced her soul. She saw Isabella, the Sunshine Girl before her wide, terrified eyes staring into the same cursed future Sunshine was being drawn into. Isabella's death, it became clear, wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a never-ending cycle, a cycle that wasn't about one girl being chosen. It was about all of them, bound together in a twisted fate they couldn't escape. Sunshine felt the desperation, the overwhelming madness that had overtaken Isabella's mind before her death, a realization that she too was being manipulated by a force far greater than herself. "We never had a choice," Isabella's voice echoed through the madness, her words now a whisper inside Sunshine's head. Sunshine's body trembled in the paralyzing grip of the curse, but it was not just the fear she felt now, it was a deeper understanding. The entities controlling the town weren't simply after her, they were using everyone. The townsfolk, the previous Sunshine Girls, even those who had never been part of the cursed cycle. They were all puppets, their lives woven into the dark plans of an insidious force. It wasn't just a curse, it was a conspiracy centuries in the making, involving every soul that had lived here. The deaths weren't mistakes. They were necessary sacrifices to feed the hunger of the entity at the heart of the town. Sunshine's blood ran cold as she realized that every death, every broken soul, had been part of this unholy cycle. But there was no time to dwell on that realization. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps and her vision began to narrow. A sudden force yanked her back from the vision, as if the town itself had spat her out. She was standing in a completely different place now. The air was thick with dampness. She was no longer in the town square but somewhere far darker, somewhere deeper. The stone beneath her feet was slick with moss and age, and the low hum of silence stretched out around her. She was in the crypt beneath the town, the place where the town's darkest secrets had been buried for centuries. Sunshine's heart raced. This was where the curse began. Her hands brushed along the walls of the crypt, where the stones were cracked and ancient. The atmosphere here was heavy, suffocating. Each step she took felt like a journey deeper into darkness. And then she saw it, the symbol carved into the wall. It was a grotesque design, dark and twisted, resembling the shape of a circle, but with lines that were jagged and sharp. It was the same symbol she had seen in the diary, the same one her mother had worn, the mark of the Sunshine Girls. The town had been built on this crypt, on this sacred, cursed ground. Sunshine's mind reeled as she finally understood the truth. The curse had never been an isolated occurrence. The town itself had been built on top of ancient burial grounds, grounds where rituals had been performed for centuries, long before the modern town was established. It wasn't just a curse born of a single, mysterious incident. It was woven into the very bones of the town, an ancient evil that had fed off the fear and pain of every resident for generations. The entity was not a god. It was something far darker, an embodiment of the town's desires, its darkest impulses. It had never cared about the people. It had cared only about feeding off their suffering, their deaths, and their fear. Every generation had given up one of its own, and in return, the town flourished. Prosperity at a cost. A price that no one could pay forever. Sunshine felt a horrible understanding settle in her gut. The death of the Sunshine Girls, the death of Isabella, wasn't just a byproduct of the curse. It was how the entity renewed its power, how it fed. The blood, the sacrifice, the terror, they were all part of the same unending cycle. And as the truth settled in her chest, Sunshine felt the sharp sting of her own impending fate. The next step in the cycle. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light in the crypt, she saw it. An altar, bathed in the same unnatural light as the moon, waiting for her. It was all too clear now. The end of the circle was drawing near. She was the next Sunshine Girl, and it was her blood that would renew the cycle, as it always had. She had been born for this. The entity had always known she would be part of this. She had no way to escape, no way out. The darkness crept closer. The whispering voices filled her ears again. "You're already ours." Sunshine stood frozen, surrounded by the oppressive weight of centuries of sacrifice. There was no escape. Not for her, and not for anyone who had ever walked this cursed town. And then she heard it, a sound that froze her in place, a low, guttural laugh that came from the very walls themselves. It was the voice of the entity, the old one, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 7. The Sacrifice. The blood moon hung ominously in the sky, casting its sickly red glow over the town. The air felt thick as if the earth itself was holding its breath. A cold, unnatural breeze swept through the town square, rustling the leaves of the long-forgotten trees that lined the streets. Sunshine stood at the center of the ritual circle, her hands bound by cold, iron chains. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing against her chest, each beat of her heart in sync with the dark pulse of the entity that had trapped her in this never-ending nightmare. The townspeople had gathered around her, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow with despair. They stood as silent witnesses, their expressions pleading, desperate for release. Her mother, once so distant and cold, stood at the front of the crowd, her gaze fixed on Sunshine with an unsettling intensity. It was as if she was both relieved and terrified of what was about to unfold. Pastor Jacob stood at the head of the ritual circle, his eyes gleaming with dark excitement, holding the ancient tome that had guided the town's evil for centuries. His voice echoed through the night air, reciting the incantations that would bring the curse to its culmination. But as he spoke, there was something different, something darker in the air. Sunshine's breath caught in her throat, and a strange pressure pressed against her mind, like an invisible force was trying to break through her thoughts. And then it came. The voice. The old one. It filled her mind, like a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, cold and ancient. The town itself seemed to shudder in response, as if it were alive, awakening to its final purpose. Sunshine. The voice echoed through her very being, each syllable sending a jolt of icy terror through her. You stand at the crossroads. You child of the sun, the last of your bloodline. The choice is yours. Her heart pounded, her chest tightening. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. There was no turning back now. The old one continued, its voice dripping with an eerie calm. You can end this cycle. And the curse. Sacrifice yourself and this town will be freed. Your people will know peace. Your mother will know peace. The cycle will end with you. Sunshine's eyes darted to her mother, standing among the crowd, her face twisted with a mixture of fear and longing. The townspeople stood motionless, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to make the impossible choice. Her mother's lips moved, though the words were barely audible over the wind. Please, save us, Sunshine. Make it end. The words cut deep. They were both a plea and an accusation. Her mother, the woman who had been so distant, now showed a level of vulnerability Sunshine had never seen before. The people around her, the ones she had once called friends, were also waiting for her decision. Mark's death, her only remaining connection to the world she once knew, had left a hollow ache in her heart. And now, this was her final choice, to sacrifice herself to end the horror that had haunted her for so long, or to give herself over to the entity and spare those she still loved. Or, the voice whispered, you can choose another path. Join me, Sunshine. Take my offer. You can save them all. Let me take your body and in return I will spare your loved ones. They will know peace and they will live. But you will become part of me, part of my eternal power. Sunshine felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Her hands trembled, the chains biting into her skin, but it wasn't just the physical pain that hurt. It was the unbearable, suffocating responsibility that she felt. Her choice was the only one that could either save or doom them all. She looked at her mother again, eyes searching for any sign of hope, any reason to trust the words of the entity. Her mother's expression wavered, the hope in her eyes almost too much to bear. But then, in the depths of her heart, Sunshine understood. The curse was never going to end. Her heart sank. This was no offer. The entity was playing with her, making her believe she had control when in reality she was just a pawn. It had been using her, manipulating her from the start, and now it was playing out the final act. Sunshine closed her eyes. Her decision was made. I will sacrifice myself. The moment the words left her lips, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The air thickened, vibrating with an unseen power. The townspeople's cries filled the air, but it was too late. As she stepped forward, preparing to give herself to the entity, she felt a rush of coldness surge through her. Her mind was flooded with visions, dark images of pain and death, of every sacrifice that had ever occurred in the town. It was not her body that the entity wanted, it was her soul. In the split second before the ritual could fully unfold, Sunshine's mind cleared and she realized the truth. She had made a terrible mistake. The entity had never intended to keep its word. It had never planned to spare anyone. It had simply used her sacrifice to grow stronger, to consume them all. Her body lurched forward, her breath catching in her throat as a wave of searing pain shot through her. She could feel herself being torn apart, the energy of the curse flowing through her, twisting and contorting her very essence. And then, in a heart-stopping moment of clarity, she saw it. The town, the people she had loved, and even her mother, they were not being spared. They were all being consumed. The ritual had not been about saving them. It had been about devouring them all. The entity had used her sacrifice to gain even more power, swallowing every soul in its wake. The agony of the townspeople filled the air as their cries echoed through the square, merging with the sounds of the cursed entity's growing strength. Sunshine screamed in horror as her body was pulled into the abyss of the curse. She had been its final piece, the missing link in the cycle that would never end. The twisted force of the entity surged through her, and in that moment, her understanding of the truth shattered. There was no escape. There never had been. The blood moon burned brighter as the final souls of the town were devoured, and the entity claimed its victory. The town was silent. The blood moon hung low, its red glow casting an unnatural hue over the streets. The ritual was complete. Sunshine had given herself willingly, sacrificing everything in an attempt to end the curse. Yet, as the final incantations were spoken and the townspeople stood motionless, waiting for the resolution they'd longed for, the world around her began to twist. Sunshine's breath faltered. Her vision blurred and the world seemed to dissolve. She felt her body go numb, her limbs heavy as if they no longer belonged to her. And then everything went dark. When Sunshine opened her eyes, it wasn't the peaceful darkness of death that greeted her. Instead, she found herself in a strange in-between place, cold, hollow, and warped. The edges of her vision were smudged, the world around her stretching like a dark, twisted shadow. She tried to move, but her body felt different, disconnected. It was as if her physical form was no longer her own. Her limbs were heavy and slow, shifting unnaturally, and her heart, if it still beat, felt distant, foreign. Then the darkness parted, revealing a horrific sight. The previous Sunshine Girls, dozens of them, stood before her, each of their faces frozen in a grotesque, eternal smile. They walked in eerie unison, their eyes hollow, their movements stiff and mechanical, like marionettes controlled by some unseen force. They were no longer human, not fully. Their bodies had been consumed, twisted by the entity's power into empty shells, nothing more than vessels of the curse. Sunshine tried to scream, but the sound that escaped her mouth was hollow, devoid of emotion. She saw herself among them, her reflection a ghastly distortion of her once lively self. Her eyes were no longer her own. They were empty, filled with a dark, swirling void. As she looked around, her gaze fell upon the familiar streets of the town. The streets she once knew so well. But now they were warped, distorted, and dead. The town was as much a part of the curse as the girls. Every corner, every building, every piece of the landscape pulsed with the malignant energy of the entity. She reached for her mother, but her hand passed through her like a phantom. Her mother was there too, a husk walking with the others. Her face was frozen in that same sickly smile, her eyes devoid of recognition. Sunshine's mother too, was now part of the curse, her soul lost forever to the old one. Then the voice came. Low, rumbling like the growl of something ancient and powerful. Welcome home, Sunshine. It was the entity, its power far more tangible now. It wasn't just a force, it was a presence, a being that had fed off the fear, pain, and terror of the townspeople for centuries. It was the foundation of the town, the very thing that had kept it alive, feeding off its own dark desires. Sunshine's sacrifice hadn't ended it, it had solidified her place within it. You were always meant to be one of us, child. The voice was both soothing and suffocating. You are not just a part of this town's history, but of something greater. The curse that once bound you now binds the world. Sunshine's mind swirled with understanding, horrible, overwhelming understanding. The curse was never meant to end. It was meant to grow, to spread beyond the borders of the town, beyond the very town itself. The entity's true intention had never been to break the cycle. It was using the Sunshine Girls to spread its malevolent influence to the outside world, to other towns, cities, and countries. She now realized, the curse had always been about control. Each Sunshine Girl was merely a vessel, a body meant to carry the entity's darkness beyond the confines of the town. Every Sunshine Girl who had died had been a key to unlocking the entity's true power. Now, Sunshine was not just a victim of the curse, She had become its servant, its vessel, its new force of terror. The sky above the town darkened, the red moon growing brighter, casting everything in an ominous glow. Sunshine felt the shift within her, a horrible alien presence that now claimed her as one of its own. She was no longer human, no longer a girl who had once laughed under the sun's warmth. Now she was something else, something darker. The entity, now fully awake and powerful, whispered its final command. Go, Sunshine. Spread the curse. Let the world know what true terror is. Sunshine felt herself move, her body no longer of her own accord, but under the influence of the entity. She stepped forward, her feet moving across the streets as though on autopilot. As she moved, the others, the previous Sunshine girls, followed her, their hollow smiles never fading. The streets that had once felt like home were now unfamiliar, transformed into the entity's domain. Sunshine crossed the town limits, and the shadow of the curse stretched beyond the town, reaching out like a dark hand, eager to wrap itself around the world. The air grew thick with darkness, a weight pressing on everything around her. As she moved further from the town, the curse began to take root. Cities far away, unaware of the ancient evil lying dormant in the small town, suddenly felt a chill. Dark winds began to stir, carrying with them whispers of fear and despair. Sunshine's footsteps were not just the steps of one girl, they were the first steps of a new age of darkness. The world was about to learn what it meant to be truly afraid. And as Sunshine looked back at the town, now distant but never forgotten, she smiled. Not out of joy, not out of sorrow, but because in that moment she understood. The curse would never end. The entity would always find new vessels, new Sunshine girls, who would carry the darkness to the ends of the earth. And with that, the cycle began anew.